Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If you think the truth always comes out, hit like and subscribe for more. When a man rejects his babysitter's unwanted advances, he thinks it's over, but by morning, his world is in ruins. He is accused of an unspeakable crime, arrested in front of his family, and labeled a predator. What began as a moment of refusal turns into a desperate fight for truth, freedom, and justice. Emailing on his tablet, Claire busied herself with the dishes and humming softly, while his kids, Ben and Lily, chatted excitedly over their cereal across the counter. Claire was an efficient babysitter, always on time, good with the kids, and respectful of the house rules, or so Ethan had assumed. What he didn't notice, however, were the stares that lingered, the way she positioned herself closer to him during casual conversations, or the way she found reasons to be close whenever Rebecca wasn't home. CLA, could I have more juice, Lily the. At the mention of his wife, Claire's lips curled, but her voice remained cheerful. It's no problem at all, I love spending time with them. Her words seemed innocent enough, but Ethan missed the way her eyes trailed over him, how her expression darkened slightly when he said it. Claire, the younger of the two, held out her cup, smiled, and poured the juice, brushing her fingers over the little girl's hand. Of course, sweetheart, Ethan looked up from his tablet. Returned his focus to his screen. Over the course of the following few weeks, CLA's behavior became more noticeable. She replaced her modest sweaters with tank tops that were a bit too tight, and she changed her jeans for shorts that hardly fit the dress code for decency. She also found ways to touch Ethan, putting a hand on his arm while laughing and slipping past him in small doorways. Ethan saw this, but ignored it, assuming she was just a loving person who didn't care about personal space. Claire was in the kitchen drinking tea while she sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Hey, I'm late, Ethan said, setting his keys down. You didn't have to wait up. Claire's eyes flicked up. I don't mind, I like being here. Rebecca laughed, she's been great company. I told her that we might need someone for extra hours next month when I travel again, and Ethan nodded, that'll be a huge help. Lit up, but not for the reasons Ethan thought. Rebecca had been away on business for merely 5 days, and today, she was finally returning home. Ethan put the kids to bed and settled in for an evening of catching up on work before Rebecca arrived. Claire had already made dinner for the kids and was tidying up when he entered the kitchen to get a drink. She turned when she heard him say, bright, busy night, yeah, just emails, and he opened the refrigerator upsetly. Claire hesitated, then took a step closer. You should take a. He shook his head when he said, I made extra pasta if you're hungry, but I had already eaten. There was something unnerving about the way she was staring at him, her expression was too eager and expectant. He closed the refrigerator and walked past her, but she didn't move aside. Instead, she touched his arm lightly with her fingers, and her voice was softer. Now I think about you a lot, he said, his stomach dropping. He looked at her intently, looking for any indication that this was a joke or misunderstanding, but her eyes told him otherwise. CLA. Although her expression faltered, Claire gave a brief laugh, saying, you don't have to pretend I see the way you look at me when she's not around. Ethan's jaw clenched. I have no idea what you're talking about, but this stops now. Although she wasn't listening, she quickly closed the distance between them, standing on her toes, to press her lips against him. She cautiously took a step back, which isn't appropriate, and moved closer. Why not? He said firmly, you work for us, because this is completely unacceptable. He grabbed her shoulders and pushed her away right away. What the hell are you doing? CLA staggered back, her face flashing with something unreadable, shock, embarrassment, and then something darker. Ethan's heart pounded, and she looked around as if she was having trouble processing what had just happened. Without saying anything else, she turned and stormed toward the door. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. He didn't realize that by rejecting her, he had sealed his fate. Rebecca was home when he was distracted by a knock on the door. Claire hurried down the empty street with her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding not from embarrassment but from rage. Ethan had pushed her away and rejected her, and by the time she got to her apartment, her idealized picture of him had fallen apart, exposing him as a hypocrite and a liar. The sting of rejection had turned into something more bitter when she realized that he would be able to resume his ideal life with his lovely wife and contented kids while she was cast aside. She sat at her desk, taking out her phone, and her mind raced, thinking that if she wanted Ethan to suffer, a text wouldn't be enough, and neither would whispers. She needed something bigger, something that would ruin him completely. She opened a notepad and started typing, writing bruises that were self-inflicted but real enough to sell the story, tears, a shaken voice, and a girl who was too scared to speak but brave enough to tell the truth. By the time she was done, her hands had stopped shaking. Ethan Reynolds had made a mistake by thinking that rejecting her would be the end of it, but he was mistaken. The following morning, he was startled awake by a pounding at the door. It was too early for guests, so he swung his legs over the side of the bed and rubbed his eyes. The knocking came again, harder this time, and Rebecca stirred next to him. Her voice was heavy with sleep, so Ethan muttered, "Who the hell is that? No idea," and pushed himself up before heading downstairs, barefoot on the cool hardwood. Ethan felt his stomach tighten as the taller officer, Mr. Reynolds, spoke first. His voice was clipped and professional, and before he could process what was happening, the officer grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back. He pulled the door open, and a rush of cold air hit him along with something much worse. Two uniformed officers stood on his doorstep, their expressions unreadable behind them. A patrol car idled at the curb, its blue and red lights flashing ominously. The other grabbed his belt and unhooked a pair of handcuffs. Ethan resisted, trying to turn them. "What's going on? You're being charged with sexual assault," the officer said in an emotionless voice. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ethan struggled, but the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Upstairs, he heard footsteps, Rebecca coming down. "What's going on?" Rebecca's voice was sharply awake, and when she saw him, the officers in the patrol car, a shadow of horror crossed. "Ethan," Rebecca, "listen to me." But before he could say another word, CLA appeared. She was wrapped in a blanket, standing a few feet away, her eyes red and swollen from forced tears, her lip quivering, a deep bruise on her cheek, her blouse torn at the sleeve, and her breath hitched. Claire flinched at the sound of her name, shrinking back as if the sight of Ethan frightened her. She whispered Rebecca pet Ethan's stomach, and the air felt like it had been sucked out of the morning at the station. Interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table, the fluorescent lighting above buzzed faintly, and his mind raced. He hadn't touched her, he knew that he'd rejected her, and now this was her retaliation. The door opened, and a detective entered. He was older, in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and an expression that told Ethan that he had already made up his mind. He dropped a file onto the table and sat, and Ethan leaned forward. This was a mistake, as the detective opened the file without glancing at him. "Claire Daniels filed a report early this." The detective exhaled through his nose and said, "You attacked her in your home while your wife was away this morning." "That's a lie. She has injuries, she's lying." He then turned a photograph around and slid it toward Ethan Claire's face, who stared back at him. Her eye was bruised, her bottom lip was swollen, and there were red marks wrapped around her wrists. Ethan recoiled, but the detective noted that medical records confirmed signs of struggle, and his heart thumped in his ears. He had not even touched her, let alone touched her, but there was a fake crime scene, a damning story, and she was setting me up. He said in a colder voice, and now the detective leaned back. Ethan thought that she was trying to ruin me, because I had rejected her, so he said, "I don't know." The detective studied him for a long time, then exhaled and closed the file, saying, "We'll see what the DA thinks." Then he stood and left, leaving Ethan slumped in. Rebecca was sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. The house was eerily quiet, and across from her, Claire was sitting curled up in a blanket with her knees tucked to her chest, still crying. Ben and Lily were upstairs, and Rebecca had sent them to their rooms in an attempt to protect them from this nightmare. "I don't understand that." Rebecca whispered that he would never do that, but last night she sucked. I told him no in a trembling breath, and he refused to stop Rebecca from flinching as the words clawed at her skin. He seemed so kind, but then he changed his attitude and looked at me as if I were nothing. When I tried to push him away, he grabbed me, and Rebecca closed her eyes. This couldn't be happening. Her husband, the man she had built a life with, the father of her children, because he wouldn't do this, would he? Claire knew that the seed of doubt had been sown, and I'm so sorry, Claire whimpering. Her own breathing felt erratic, so I assumed she needed some space to gather her thoughts. She entered the kitchen and took her phone out of her pocket, but by the time Ethan was officially charged, the case had already made headlines, with missed calls, messages from friends, family, and inquiries from the media. Businessman Ethan Reynolds was arrested on charges of assault and betrayal of trust, and when the babysitter spoke out, I was terrified for my life and social media erupted in outrage. His investors pulled out, the company cut off ties, the trial hadn't even begun, and he was already guilty in the eyes of the public. Rebecca's parents called to beg her to leave him because they didn't want their grandchildren to be linked to the scandal, where the children were being stared at in school, and other parents whispered in low voices. Things were getting out of control. Days later, Rebecca was drowning. When she visited Ethan in jail, he looked different, his eyes were sunken and exhausted, and he straightened when he saw her. Rebecca raised a hand, and I'm not sure what to believe. His face was twisted, and you were unaware that she had bruises. Ethan, the policeman, claimed that I hadn't touched her. His voice was harsh, so I told her to leave. But Rebecca's lips were pressed into a thin line, and the silence stretched. You need to tell the truth, she said, and at last, his hands curled into fists. I'm telling the truth. Do you really think I could do this? He demanded, and she turned before he could say anything more. As Ethan Reynolds was led to the defendant's table, his suit was a poor disguise for the exhaustion weighing him down. He could feel the eyes on him, judgmental and unyielding. The prosecution had portrayed him as a predator, and the public had already decided his fate before the trial had even started. Claire was sitting at the witness stand, wrapped in a soft cardigan, her hair pulled back in a way that made her appear even younger and more vulnerable. She clutched a tissue with her hands. When the prosecutor asked her to recall the night of the alleged attack, her hands trembled just enough to be convincing, and she took a deep breath as if preparing herself for the trauma. He told me to stay late, and she started breaking her voice at the perfect time. I assumed this was to help with the kids, but after they went to bed, he changed Ethan's jar, and Claire sniffled and dabbed at imaginary tears. I told him no, and I pleaded with him to stop, but he refused to listen, so she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the courtroom collapsed. The jury was deathly silent as they watched her closely, with some of them shifting in discomfort. A middle-aged woman in the front row of jurors appeared especially shaken, her lips pressed together as she repressed emotion. The prosecutor came to the bench and lowered his voice, saying, "Claire, take your time. I know this is difficult, but can you tell the jury what happened next?" Her lower lip quivered, and she hesitated as if she couldn't bear to relive it. Then, in a quiet murmur, Ethan's voice reverberated throughout the crowd. The jury was buying it when it was their turn. Attorney Stephen Calloway exhaled slowly next to him, but Ethan understood what that meant. Calloway approached calmly, but firmly, saying, "Miss Daniels, you say my client forced himself on you, but there is no DNA evidence, no surveillance footage, and no eyewitness testimony aside from your own." Claire stiffened. Calloway continued looking through a file, "But we have evidence that refutes your claim." The house's security system log revealed that the doors were locked at 9:30 p.m. A sharp blow. Calloway's jaw flexed, Ethan clenched his fists beneath the table, and Claire quickly wiped at her eyes, her face changing from a fragile victim to a wounded resolve. "Before you claim that the attack happened, there is no evidence of a struggle, broken furniture, or forced entry." "Of course, there is no forced entry, he lives there." She turned to the jury, her voice full of fake pain. "Do you think men like him need to break in?" "They don't, they wait until you trust them, then they take what they want." The prosecutor stood objection, badgered the witness, and the judge nodded. Ethan's lawyer hesitated, but he nodded, realizing that he couldn't afford to push too hard because he could already see how the jury was leaning. Rebecca sat in the second row, her hands clasped in her lap, barely breathing since the trial began. Every word that came out of Cla's mouth twisted inside her like a knife, and it wasn't just what Claire was saying. Rebecca had spent years with Ethan. She was familiar with his voice, his laugh, and the way he tucked their kids in at night. Could that same man have done something so horrible? Doubt had long since taken root inside her, growing like a vine and choking at her memories of the man she married. She turned to face Ethan, who was sitting rigid, his expression grim, and his eyes were pleading and shaking. Ethan barely heard the words as the foreman stood, and the jury found the defendant with his heartbeat thundering in his ears guilty. A gasp echoed through the courtroom, and Cla slumped in relief, as if she had barely survived the trial alive. The prosecutor put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and Ethan felt his knees buckle beneath him. They were devastated, not with guilt, but with disbelief, for the first time since his arrest. "Mr. Ethan Reynolds, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in prison," he rang out, hammering the final nail into his coffin. Ethan closed his eyes, and Rebecca's breath caught in the crowd. He turned to look for her face, but she was already moving and her expression was unreadable as she stood, grabbed her purse, and left. Cla stayed seated, her lips slightly curling as she gave Ethan one final look. By the time Ethan was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the media was already outside. Cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Reynolds, do you have anything to say to your wife about how it feels to betray your family? Do you regret what you did?" Ethan's face was blank, his mind was numb, his business was gone, his marriage was over, and his children, God, would grow up thinking their father was a monster owing to a lie that night. Claire was sitting in her apartment, scrolling through the news headlines when Ethan Reynolds sentenced justice for Brace survivor Claire Daniels for betraying the trust of the babysitter, who spoke out. The house had never felt this quiet as Rebecca stood in the doorway of her children's rooms, watching them sleep, Ben curled into a tight ball with his fists clenched. Even in his dreams, Lily, clutching the same stuffed rabbit Ethan had given her for her 4th birthday. She smiled and put her phone down. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Will Ethan ever clear his name, or will Claire's lies bury him forever? If you're on his side, hit like and keep watching. This battle is just getting started. Rebecca had tried to convince herself that life without Ethan was necessary for months, moving their photos of him out of sight and refusing to talk about the case when neighbors whispered about it, but the truth lingered like a stubborn shadow creeping in when she least expected it. She had done the right thing, had she not gone downstairs and poured herself a glass of wine, but it did nothing to calm the gnawing feeling in her gut. Something. She looked toward Ethan's old office, the door still closed and undisturbed since the trial, and a quiet voice inside her whispered, "Look." Rebecca hesitated before entering the room, which smelled faintly of Ethan's cologne despite months of abandonment. Claire had been trembling and her voice shaking with just the right amount of vulnerability since the moment Claire came to her that night. However, had she really believed her? Might enter at any time and put things back to normal. She put a hand to her forehead, wondering why she was even seeking an excuse to absolve herself of her guilt. She then moved toward the desk, running her fingers over the papers before coming to a stop at the filing cabinet. She had completely avoided this room following the trial, unwilling to confront any remnants of Ethan, but she was unable to explain why she felt the need to search until she noticed a small external hard drive hidden behind a stack of folders. Rebecca scowled and took it out. Her pulse jumped as she turned it over in her hands, forgetting about the security cameras Ethan had installed for protection. She had to check with trembling hands, and she plugged the hard drive into Ethan's old laptop. The screen flickered before displaying a list of timestamped video files. She scrolled down, pausing at the night Cla had accused him of clicking, and the grainy footage filled the screen. Rebecca held her breath as the scene played out in silence. Claire entered the living room and glanced around, and a moment later, Ethan entered from the kitchen, and based on their body language, she could tell that there was no tension or indication of an argument. However, as Claire approached too closely, Rebecca's nails dug into her palm, and she watched as Cla put a hand on Ethan's arm and then his chest. Ethan shook his head and retreated, and Claire moved in again, this time reaching for his face. Ethan felt sick, and she retreated, pushing her hands away. Claire hesitated, then her face displayed a look of anger before turning. Rebecca's stomach knotted as she walked out, and she kept watching over and over again. There was no violence or assault, only rejection, and Claire hadn't handled it well. She sat back with her hands to her mouth, and Ethan had been telling the truth. Rebecca staggered back from the desk, bile rising in her throat, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The trial, the media frenzy, the accusations, and she had stood by and allowed them to happen. She had to fix this, so Rebecca clenched her fists, willing herself to move to think, but how she couldn't just walk into the police station and say, "Oops, my mistake." Flashbacks of the past few months crashed over her, including the way Ethan had looked at her when she left the courtroom, the nights Ben had asked when his dad was coming home, and Lily whispering to her stuffed rabbit that she missed her daddy since she had taken Ethan away from them from everything. The damage was done, no one would believe her, and Claire had deceived a whole courtroom, the media, and a jury. This wasn't an accident, it was deliberate, so if Rebecca wanted to make things right, she couldn't just reveal the truth, she had to destroy the lie. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, staring at the hard drive in front of her, while the video played in her head on repeat all night. Cla reached for Ethan, but Ethan pushed her away, and Claire left without a scratch. She had testified against Ethan, sat across from him in court, and led the jury to believe he was a monster. If she suddenly changed her story, the world would see a wife attempting to save her guilty husband rather than a woman righting a wrong. She needed help from someone who could expose the truth without bias, and her fingers trembled as she picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and typed a name into her. If anyone could unravel Claire's story, it was Adam Carter, an investigative journalist whose articles under his byline spanned more than 10 years of wrongful convictions, corrupt trials, and cases that collapsed under closer examination. She clicked the contact page and paused just a moment before typing, "I need your help. I think I sent an innocent man to prison." Ethan adjusted his grip on the food tray as he navigated the packed prison cafeteria. The rules were straightforward: keep your head down, don't make. The inmates parted as he passed their stares, heavy with unspoken threats. He felt it coming, and then a shoulder checked him hard, sending his tray clattering to the ground. A low chuckle followed, and then Ethan straightened slowly, locking eyes with the man who had done it, Luis Ortega, a career criminal with too many tattoos and too little patience for weakness. He had been watching Ethan since the first day, waiting for an opportunity to remind him. This rule did not apply when you are a convicted predator. Ethan didn't react. Instead, he stooped, grabbed his tray, and left. This was his only option. Back in his cell, he took out a stack of papers from under his mattress. They included letters to Rebecca, Ben, Lily, and Rebecca, some of which were apologetic, some of which were pleading, and all of them went unanswered. During visitation, his old friend Mark was sitting across from him, and his eyes were scanning him. He exhaled, "You look like hell." Mark leaned forward, "I don't know how, but we're going to get you out of here." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. Mark was silent for a while, before he took something out of his pocket. It was a newspaper. Ethan scowled as he unfolded it, and the headline stared back at him. Journalist Adam Carter is looking into Reynolds' conviction. Was it based on false information? Rebecca met Adam Carter in a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town, her hands gripping the hard drive as if it might vanish if she let go. The journalist examined her, tapping a pen. Rebecca slid the hard drive across the table, and he plugged it into his laptop, watching in silence as the grainy video played in real time, capturing every detail that advanced the rejection CLA's furious exit, and then he leaned back, saying, "Why now?" Rebecca took a shaky breath. "Because I was wrong." Adam didn't react, because he had heard confessions before. That's not enough. People don't change their minds overnight. What happened? Adam's expression hardened. "So we dig to see if she's done this before we find it, and then we make sure the world knows exactly who Claire Daniels is." It didn't take long for Adam to shut down his laptop. CLA is protected by public opinion. If we expose this, she'll spin it and say he threatened her off camera, that she was afraid, that she left quietly to protect herself. This will make people want to believe her. Rebecca swallowed hard. They found more, a professor at her college who abruptly stopped teaching, and they discovered that Claire wasn't just a liar, she was a predator. The problem was that none of these cases had gone to trial. There were no official charges against Flagg, a high school teacher who had lost his career due to accusations that never made it to trial. The school never filed charges, but the damage was done, and he moved out of state. Rebecca stared at the article, her stomach turning. Adam nodded, and I bet my career she'll do it again. Records simply ruined reputations, and that wasn't enough to clear Ethan, they also needed Claire to confess. Rebecca waited outside Claire's college dorm, her heart pounding. The video was stored on a flash drive in her pocket, and she had practiced every possible exchange and argument Claire might make with her. When the door finally opened, Claire froze, and her face broke into a grin. What a surprise! Rebecca entered without waiting for an invitation, and Claire closed the door behind her, crossing her arms too. What do I owe Rebecca for the visit? She held up the flash drive, and I know what you did. Claire didn't blink, and you're going to have to be more specific. Rebecca's jaw clenched. The footage, CLA. You came on to Ethan, and he rejected you. You lied for a moment. CLA's expression faltered, and then she laughed. Rebecca then slammed the flash drive onto the desk. I can go to the press, and I can take this directly to the courts. That would be a huge mistake. Rebecca's stomach clenched. Threatening me, I'm giving you an out. Claire said, take it, smoothly. Rebecca exhaled sharply, no, you're going to admit what you did. Claire sighed as if she were dealing with a child. What do you want? Money? Apologies, tell me your price. Rebecca's eyes darkened. You think this is about money? And she took a step closer. This time, though, her lips pursed, and she tilted her head. You're making a mistake, AK, Rebecca said in a steady voice. In his dimly lit office, Rebecca sat across from Adam with her fingers curled around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Her expression was unreadable, and as she turned to leave, Claire's voice stopped her cold as she reached the door. You're not the only one who can play dirty. They both knew that Rebecca was too skilled at this and too confident in the armor of her lies, so if they wanted to clear Ethan's name, they needed leverage. Adam tapped his pen against his desk without thinking. Adam found a lead quickly. Within hours, he had located Madison Clark, an old classmate of Claire's. When he called, she didn't seem surprised to hear Claire's name. She said, she's in trouble, isn't she? In a cautious voice, but Adam replied, not yet. Rebecca and Adam met Madison at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. She was in her early 20s, dark-haired, and had a look of wary reluctance. She stirred her coffee absently, as if debating how much. Madison paused, then reached for her purse, took out her phone, and scrolled through the old messages Claire and I used to have. She admitted that I thought she was being dramatic at the time, but she knew how to ruin people. You were in high school with Claire. Adam started, Madison said, because we need to know what kind of person she was back then. Madison laughed dryly, but she was exactly the same, just less polished. Rebecca leaned in. Did she ever do anything like this before, Madison? I told you years ago that he intentionally failed me, but don't worry, I'm handling it. Madison had responded, men are so stupid that they always think they have the power, but I can snap my fingers and take it all away. Rebecca's skin pricked when she said that Madison had come on to her after she failed his class, after he lost his job, after his wife divorced him, and after he moved out of state. There was never any proof, but people assumed the worst, so Adam exhaled slowly. Did she ever admit? Ethan had learned the rhythm of survival. Keep your head down, don't react, don't engage, but even that wasn't enough. The attack occurred during yard time, with a shove from behind and a fist slamming into his ribs. Before he could react, he hit the ground, and discomfort exploded through his side. Madison's gaze darkened, but she didn't have to, so she boasted about it to anyone who would listen. Rebecca gripped the edge of the table. When he woke up, he was in the infirmary, and the prison warden was sitting next to his bed with his arms crossed. You think we don't know what you are, the voice above him sneered. You think we don't know what you are? Ethan gasped for air, but he didn't fight back because there was no point. Someone else struck him in the shoulder. Then, all of a sudden, whistles came from the guards, and the attackers dispersed into the chaos of the yard. Ethan lay there, struggling to breathe, and tasted blood in his mouth. When Rebecca noticed the bruises on Ethan's face during their next visitation, something inside of her snapped. He hardly spoke, his right eye swelled, and his lips split when she reached for his. The warden shook his head. Protective custody is full, and let's face it, you don't have many friends in here. Ethan closed his eyes, knowing that the warden sighed. I'd suggest finding someone who still gives a damn about you because next time I might not be able to pull you out in time. He hesitated, but she whispered, I'm getting you out of here. Ethan whispered, I'm getting you out of here, and Rebecca's grip tightened. I found proof Claire did this, before Ethan's fingers twitched beneath hers.